A ravaged state such as Kenya cannot be recreated without an agenda for transitional justice to end public corruption and prevent human rights abuses. But transitional justice cannot be achieved unless the mistakes and atrocities of the past are properly, fairly, and comprehensively investigated, the perpetrators held accountable, and the victims recognized and their dignity restored. Transitional justice is any mechanism used to reform and reconcile a state emerging from repressive regimes and conflicts. The Agenda Number 4 of the National Accord could be described as one of the major transitional justice programs for Kenya. The Unturned Stones is a 4-part documentary on impunity and historical injustices. It captures the patterns of human rights violations and economic crimes from the colonial to modern Kenya. In this episode, we will follow 2 patterns of state-sponsored or condoned violence. That is, politically instigated violence and massacres, especially from independence to date. Inarguably, Kenya has witnessed its politicians perfect the colonial tactics of divide and rule against ethnic lines. Politically instigated violence has become a norm in independent Kenya. A nation that once shared in a common vision at pre-independence has come to be fragmented post-independence. Just what comprises as politically instigated violence?
The history of this country has been a very violent history. Although the type of violence that's been visited on this country seems to, over the years, have been put in a little box and put aside. We've chosen to forget as a country, and the reason I believe we've chosen to forget is because we're traumatized.
Political violence is not a very recent phenomenon in this country. If one were to talk about the colonial period, in some cases the colonial administration was always instigating violence against the Mau Mau in one way or the other. I would like to point out that the political violence that we are talking about today is politicians mobilizing their own ethnic communities against members of another community, and they themselves, the politicians, now identifying a single issue like the issue of access to land or land ownership and saying that this is the issue we are mobilizing around. But of course, one needs to point out that these are not the real causes of this political violence. It's not that the people being chased away from certain areas do own this land illegally.
This is not a new phenomenon, nor is it a method that politicians have recently discovered, but rather one that has been in use for years, perfected by each successive regime, especially if there is an envisaged competition or dispute in electoral amongst other political processes.
Historically, we understand when the white settlers came in, first and foremost, the first thing they did was to divide and rule this country. By the way of dividing and rule, they had to displace some people from some areas so that they can be able to control and take charge of a certain given regions. We saw this happening from the coast to Lake Victoria.
One may also want to say that during the Kenyatta period there were different forms of political violence that were taking place, and in particular political violence against the landless.
This was successfully done through the administrative way of governance, where the district commissioners, the provincial commissioners were very powerful, and by then they were able to displace some people from one given region to the other in the quest of land. The issue of land grabbing came into fore.
During the Kenyatta regime, political violence was unleashed by the state security apparatus against the communities of northern Kenya during the so-called shifter succession wars in the 1960s. Politically instigated violence gained more momentum during President Moi's era.
Mimi, Daniel Toroitich Arab Moi, naapa kwamba nitakuwa mwaminifu kwa Jamhuri ya Kenya.
When President Moi ascended to power in 1978, he initiated the so-called Nyayo philosophy of following the footsteps of President Jomo Kenyatta. Nothing changed. He followed the philosophy of Fuata Nyayo, and with it, he took the politics of dictatorship to new heights. After the 1982 coup, the KANU regime positioned itself to deal with any threat to its power.
In 1986, that's the first time we saw the first eviction of the post-independence government, where people were evicted from the forest and they were not given alternative.
Let them, when the election come, let them seek mandate. Wakipata watu, waje kubadilisha mambo kama wanapata watu wa kutosha. Lakini watapata ngo.
In 1991, the clamor for democracy led to the repeal of Section 2A in the Constitution and the forced acceptance of multi-party politics. Following the forced acceptance of the multi-party politics in 1991, the ruling party KANU resorted to political violence as a tool for suppressing intercommunal dissent, and as a result, disenfranchising the pro-opposition communities in the Rift Valley, Western and Nyanza provinces.
At the time of reintroduction of multi-party politics in this country, there was vicious opposition by the then ruling party KANU and President Moi in particular and those around him, arguing if multi-party democracy is introduced, then it's going to weaken the powers of President Moi. By 1991, already tension was very high in Rift Valley.
If you know I have played my part in contributing towards development of Kenya, vote for me.
Na hiyo ndio chitaka letu. Yeye kubali wizi wamefanya of 900 billion.
In 1992, KANU won the hotly contested election and was back in full power amid the massive violence and irregularities. All seemed calm despite low levels of tension.
Hapo ndipo mambo yalianza kupinduka. Ikawa ni lugha ni ati multipartyism ni kuondoa one tribe kwa uongozi sababu hawataki. Kulikuwa na mikutano mingi sana mfululizo hasa ya wanasiasa wakisema mambo ya madoadoa, watu warudi kwao. Ndipo haya mambo yakaanza ya vita na vita vikaendelea. Lakini kama mimi hasa nyumba yangu ilichomwa tarehe 22 mwezi wa pili. That was 92.
By 1997, the violence had flared up all over again. This time extending to the coast province where the pro-opposition upcountry residents were targeted. In all these situations, the government was directly involved and disguised itself as militia warriors, Morans, Jeshis, amongst other surrogates. John Irungu lived and worked in Molo at the time.
By then I had resorted to poultry keeping, but all of a sudden the ethnic clashes erupted. All my poultry farm was put to fire and I lost everything.
Vilivyoisha, watu waliketi hivyo. Kukawa na yule tu uhasama kuogopana. Naogopa kumkuta Kirui. Kirui anaogopa kukuta Mwangi sababu ya ule wadui tu.
KANU ruled up to the year 2002 when it was removed by NARC, steered by Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga, among other reform advocates. This popular removal of KANU was viewed by many as an era of change, a time Kenyans would start to realize their dreams. Euphoria gripped the country. Change was highly expected, though this anticipation lasted only for a mere 2 years. The NARC regime failed to reform and unite the country, leading to the 2005 constitutional referendum. As the banana and orange campaigns got into high gear by wooing supporters, the process set a course for hair-raising division amongst Kenyans.
After referendum, things turned the other way around. My close neighbors, we have been staying with for so long, friendly, sharing, looking even change, eating, turned to be enemies. I couldn't imagine. One of them, I sincerely say, one of them, whom is also a neighbor to me, because The distance between my plot and his plot is only the tarmac. He's the one who made me disabled.
Okay, you got it?
The constitutional referendum led to the breakup of the NARC coalition government. By the time the 2007 elections were approaching, the country was entirely polarized and the stage was set for the worst violence in Kenyan history. The country exploded into pockets of carnage. Kenyans had descended into madness.
It has been a big task to women, being that these men left all the burden to them, so the women get a big task because they don't have jobs, they don't have school fees for their children, and that brings about sexual harassment because she has no money and there is someone who wants to give him money. He will just be easily lured into that temptation.
I think women have played a triple role. They've been mainly victims, they've also been perpetrators, and they've also been bystanders of politically instigated violence. And I think as Kenyan women, we have to own our roles, both positive and negative. And from there, we're able to say, yes, this is truly who we are, and these are the various roles we've played when it comes to violence and politically instigated violence in Kenya.
Since 1991, politically instigated violence has always led to humanitarian crisis, killings, massive displacement of hundreds of thousands, destruction of property, as well as loss of livelihoods. Politically instigated violence has also taken a different turn, where politicians have been known to exploit or abuse local cultural beliefs and practices for their own selfish gain.
We've been victims and continue being victims of deliberate and I would say calculated armed cattle rustling. Armed cattle rustling in some communities as a cultural and historical phenomenon, and where people call for raids before they are initiated, for example. For one to prove that he is man enough to represent them in parliament, he encourages his foot soldiers to also prove that they are men enough capable. It has now been complicated by the question of arms, and when you look at it, you see the natural resource competition.
So why is a young democratic country like Kenya, that has bursting potential to lead the region, been torn apart by periodical political violence?
Poor governance has led to a situation where communities have been so impoverished that they think their destiny is dependent on their own elites, their own individuals getting access to political power, on the understanding that once they get into political power, that political power will translate into economic benefits for these communities. Unfortunately, that's not the case.
Beyond the politically instigated violence, state-sponsored and condoned violence has taken the form of massacres. Kenya has experienced violence in its different forms, where community raises against another community, civilian against civilian. For the most part, massacres are whispers, barely heard or known by the rest of the populace. While most massacres have been state-instigated, others have been perpetrated by non-state actors in the full face of the Kenya government. When a state turns on its own people and unleashes or condones violence of unprecedented magnitude on its harmless civilians, there must be more than meets the eye. Such violations have included the Kisumu massacre of the 1960s and the Wagala massacre of the 1980s. Kenya also has a history of massacres that have taken place as a result of one community rising against another. Massacres have been used as a tool of political repression and systematic marginalization of certain regions.
I think life is cheap in Kenya, particularly for people who are not considered to you know, have the economic means or the political means to protest. So then a massacre committed against a community that may be far away, or literally or figuratively away from the center of power, becomes very easy, because actually who cares? And it's made easier by the fact that most of the massacres that we've seen have happened in areas that are geographically far away, and whose issues and grievances and sort of with the state are not understood.
I think it's having poor leadership within our state. That's why they use the wrong mechanisms to address issues. And this is one of the reasons why they use brutal forces, police brutality against their own citizens.
So there have been several massacres in northern Kenya. There's been the one in Kisumu. You could arguably call what's been happening to supposed members of militia organizations massacres. And I think it comes from a failure of imagination on the part of the state in terms of how to address insecurity.
We turn our focus to the Wagala massacre as an example of this form of violence. The Wagala massacre remains one of the most gruesome anti-human rights acts in northern Kenya.
You know, at independence, people of Somali origin had been promised the right to a referendum to decide where they wanted to belong. You know, did they want to stay in Kenya, or did they want to join with Greater Somalia? At the time, the decision was to join with Greater Somalia, at which point our founding president decided, no, that's not going to happen.
And there was a war, and the war everybody knows is called Shifta War. Shifta meaning the rogues, the thieves. The Kenya government was trying to paint those people as a very bad group of people. Actually, they succeeded in doing that. And one of the conditions for the war to end was for Kenya to actually assimilate the people of northern Kenya into the Kenyan system, develop the place, provide facilities, make actually those who are fighting the government to be citizens of this country. But what happened was actually the reverse. Kenya imposed sort of an emergency law on northern Kenya.
Kenyatta decided to quash the rebellion by using the state military might. Many people were tortured, raped, and killed. Over the years, the state continued its sporadic attacks on this marginalized community. The nature and intensity of attacks escalated in magnitude and violence.
In 1982, it took a different turn, because the political environment then was different in northern Kenya. Some of the communities were politically correct, others were not. The military and the other security forces went from house to house, detaining, arresting the Godia men who are above 12. In that process, they were burning houses, they were raping women, they were, telling people actually to leave their homes and go into some sort of a concentration camp. And in the process, they actually brought together about more than 5,000 men between the age of 12 years up to 90 years. They kept those people in Wagala airstrip, and it lasted for about 5 days. And in the process, they were killing people, they were torturing people. Some of them were burnt alive. They were actually brought together, their clothes were piled on top of them, gasoline was actually poured on them and burnt. So in the process, people were actually seeing what is happening, and day after day they're seeing their friends are being killed. And on the 5th day, they decided this cannot continue, and they all scaled the fence of the airstrip and ran for their lives. And then the army started shooting, and a lot of people were killed. The military eventually piled all the bodies on lorries, military lorries, and disposed them all over the place in very funny places. A few people were rescued by some well-wishers, and essentially that's how the actual Wagala took place. That's the Wagala massacre for you.
State-sanctioned political violence and massacres indicate how repressive governments directly or indirectly target a certain community for repression. The state had betrayed and turned on the very people it was meant to protect by killing, maiming, and tormenting thousands of innocent boys and men. This had a far-reaching impact on the community.
Once you kill the men who are earning a living for their families, then you made the community, not only did you kill them, but you also killed them economically.
A woman might have 10 children and she's lost the breadwinner, who is the husband or the son or the father. And she's totally left with 10 children or so to fend for. And she has no education, she has no skill. So you can imagine, without any education, without skill, what do? Some resort to selling their bodies. So they would do things they would not have done in normal circumstances.
Because what happened was, suddenly we have about 15,000 or so orphans, about 3,000 to 4,000 women who are widowed and all that. And a lot of the time, people became very poor.
It leads to massive marginalization of a people as a community, massive marginalization of ordinary citizens, and massive loss of rights of many people in this country.
With the void left after the brutal murders of productive members of the community, the effects of the massacres are felt for generations. But for the survivors, there is no peace, no rest, until the truth is comprehensively told and the perpetrators brought to book.
First, we need to know why. See, the why is still the question that's hanging on top of us. So, what was so pressing that the government could come up one morning and kill 5,000 of its citizens? That's the question we'd like to actually be answered.
We all have to take personal responsibility for assuming that everybody in Kenya is rational and there's a cause for why people behave the way they do, and try and understand that cause so that we're listening not in terms of defensiveness about where we might fit in terms of whatever is being thrown out, but we listen with a sense of, okay, what's my responsibility here in terms of understanding the other and trying to engage in a manner that would be constructive for both of us.
It could be good if I go back to these people and try to reconcile with them. You see, when one by one, when I go back to you, I just know very well that you, brother, you did this and that to me. You burnt all my items, you burnt my children, you killed my woman or my husband or my child. It will be good if I just come face to face with you and at least try to reconcile to one another.
This young nation of Kenya has stood the risk of tearing itself apart. Every election from 1964 to 2007 has brought about ever-increasing atrocities. This has only amounted to bloodshed, murder, slaughter, destruction of property, and displacement of thousands. The historical truth about communal and state violence has to be told. The past must be confronted, the state and perpetrators must be audited, and the country must be exorcised of the ghosts that still haunt it. As the country continues with its policy, legal and institutional reform agenda that will lay the foundation for transitional justice and the reconciliation process, Kenya must cement its people as one way of avoiding recurrent violence.
Tumejaribu kuwa na mikutano ya amani na tunapitisha kauli nyingi sana jinsi tunavyoweza kuwa na uhusiano mzuri. Kwa mfano, majuzi tulienda pale wanaita Sundu River na tukaanza common market, na imekuwa a very good market sababu wao wanaleta kondoo zao nasi tunaenda tunanunua. Now the trade is inajaribu kuleta ule uhusiano mzuri.
Naweza toa changamoto yangu niwaeleza wa Kenya kuwa tusahau hali ya chama na siasa, na kama tutaendelea nazo tusahau uadui ule unaweza kuja juu ya chama. Tujue ati kwamba saa zile unaumiza mwenzako hata wewe unajiumiza. tuelewane ati sisi ni wa Kenya, na sisi tukiwa wa Kenya tutaishi Kenya hii na tupendane.
If that family can reconcile, okay, and now go to the extended family and reconcile, and now move to the community and reconcile, then we'll build a nation. What does that mean? It means it won't happen today. It will not happen within a 2-year program. It's a process. It's painful. It's very, very, very untidy. And we have to be ready for that as Kenyans. And we mustn't be ready for quick fix solutions or solutions that are neat and put in a box. I don't think that that's a sensible way forward.
People can't reconcile when they're still angry, when they still feel that they haven't been heard. The issue will just flare up again. So you have to really say, in terms of the outcome of what happened last year, one community might feel particularly victimized, but we shouldn't assume that the community that seemed to be the aggressor doesn't also feel victimized for another reason that in fact caused this effect. And that, I think, is the more difficult thing to do. I mean, it's easy to say let's forgive and forget, but that's what we did at independence, and you can see where that's led us. Nowhere particularly constructive.
For a country that has been caught in a web of violence, a way has to be forged to break the vicious cycle that only leads to self-destruction. There has to be political will to pull the fragile country out of its tribulations.
The other thing I think is our leaders have they have academic excellence, but they don't have the experience of of managing responsibilities. So I think they need capacity building, proper capacity building in terms of leadership. They need to be in touch with the realities.
We have not seen the coalition government begin even to attend to some of the reforms that have been contributing to political violence. The more we delay in effecting democratic reforms, the more the signs of political violence become much more clearer. Any other wave of violence in this country is going to fragment this country in a very unprecedented manner. We are even likely to have even class conflict in this country. The youth who are unemployed seeking to revenge against the people they think are responsible for their not being employed, the rich, anyone who seems to have wealth. So any form of political violence in the future, which is likely to happen anyway, is likely to be extremely uncontrollable.
For a nation to foster democracy, rule of just laws, respect for human rights, and accountability and national reconciliation, it must deal with past human rights violations and economic crimes. The Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, TJRC, and existing court processes, among other reforms, may provide part of the mechanisms to banish impunity from Kenya. These mechanisms must be structured and sequenced in a manner that enhances effective coordination, fosters justice, and provides victims as well as perpetrators a platform to engage and reconcile with each other. But we all know that Kenya has had so many commissions of inquiry and ineffective judicial system. Borrowing from the past, the question that lingers in the minds of many is, will the Commission live up to its mandate?
Well, you know, there's a big debate around the purpose of commissions that essentially seem to allow for impunity, where there's no sort of retributive justice aspect. This TJRC is meant